Rocket Lab is chasing more mass to orbit with its biggest mission yet. Peter Beck tells me what opportunities and challenges are still to come in the space economy.
I think the biggest thing to happen in space has not yet happened. Whoever can put the services in space and maintain them and deliver service from space at the fastest rate, at the lowest cost, is going to win. You know, my two competitors are the two richest people on the planet. It's do or die. Like you have to build a profitable company to survive.
It's Tuesday the 24th of October and you're watching Markets with Madison. New industries are emerging as space becomes more open for business. NASDAQ-listed Rocket Lab is undertaking its biggest mission yet, building a heavier rocket to put it on the path to competing with Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin. They're all chasing mass to orbit in what's forecast to be a $2 trillion space economy. In this episode, I'll give you an inside look into how Rocket Lab is upping its own stakes in the space race. Rocket Lab's Mission Operations and Control Centre in Auckland is top secret. It's where its Electron rockets are made, and some components of its soon-to-be bigger Neutron rocket are under development. For that reason, there's a lot we can't show you. But the Chief Executive, Peter Beck, gives a good sense of the speed of innovation in space. He has to be this fast when he's going up against Elon Musk. Rocket Lab has launched 39 times, while Musk's SpaceX has launched its heavier Falcon rockets 273 times. Its most recent launch dropped 22 Starlink satellites into orbit. That number is expected to boom in the next few years, with more providers getting into satellite broadband, including Amazon, which just launched aboard a ULA rocket. It highlights an industry that's expanding beyond building and launching rockets. With new industries emerging, who will dominate the space economy? In this interview with Beck, he reveals what role Rocket Lab is going to play, and the challenges his company and the whole industry still need to overcome to get there. Peter Beck, thank you so much for your time. It's amazing to be here. Thanks for having us in.
My pleasure.
Now, we're going to talk about the space economy more broadly, but I do just want to start on more recent news. You recently sold, 3.6 million shares? Why are you selling?
Well, it's really for some estate planning purposes, and I've started a foundation called the Beck Foundation where I'm doing some cool stuff. And I've always had a real passion to support New Zealand entrepreneurs, and I think I've maybe 35 companies and counting now. So the foundation is another way to support other more interesting things.
So your heart and your head is still in Rocket Lab though?
Oh my God, yes, yeah. No, it represents I think it's a fraction over 6% of my total holdings. It's a small piece to take off the table.
Good to hear, I didn't doubt it for a second. You're going for accessibility with Electron. You're now chasing, more mass to orbit with your bigger rocket Neutron. Why is bigger better now?
So Electron fills a really important market niche, and that market niche is growing and the product's going really well and all the rest of it, so that's great. But there's also another market niche that we can go after. And for the longest time I said I was never going to build a bigger rocket, In fact, you can probably find an interview somewhere where I said I was going to tattoo it across my forehead. I was that resolute that we were
I imagine you've defected on that now, you're not actually going to
Absolutely,
tattoo it? Okay, good.
No, well, I ate the hat to absolve myself from that sin, but nevertheless, it's become really, really obvious to us that there was a place for us to play. And one of our competitors become really, really dominant in that kind of medium lift capacity. And a monopoly is never a great thing to have in any market. So we felt that we could actually go after that opportunity, and we thought we could be really successful in it. And we'd kind of built all the pieces, Electron, it's kind of semi-reusable, so we learned a lot of lessons about reusability, and that sort of gave us a lot of confidence to go after a reusable large launch vehicle.
Does that effectively mean that you feel like you've democratized access to space with smaller spacecraft now, so that you feel like you can move on? Unquestionably.
So before Electron came along, the cheapest flight you could buy was literally somewhere between 30 and 50 million US dollars. That if you had a small dedicated payload that you wanted to get to orbit, there was the Minotaur or the Pegasus launch vehicle, $30 to $45 million, thereabouts. And we took that down to 7.5. So, it enabled a whole new kind of, place within the market, and enabled a whole bunch of really, really cool missions. So definitely that box is ticked. We'll continue to scale that product, and it's all good, but it's time to move on to something that's bigger and a bigger opportunity.
And why is now a time to chase mass to orbit? Because frequency and reliability still aren't completely perfect, and dare I bring it up, you lost a satellite recently, so why are you still going bigger when nothing's perfect yet?
Well, nothing is ever perfect in this game. Like it's an absolute assault on physics. 2% of everything that it weighs in the rocket is actually the satellite you put in orbit. So you need a fraction of a percent out on anything, and you don't get to orbit. So it's always massively difficult. Electron's reliability, to your point, like we had a recent failure, which is devastating. But its reliability is still extraordinary, especially amongst small launch vehicles. It is just demonstrably better than any other small launch vehicle. So that being said, you can't let that stop. You developing new products and moving on. The larger launch vehicle is servicing a really, really important part of the market, and it opens the market up for us for doing much larger things as well.
How big is that market? I've seen lots of numbers thrown around. What do you price it at?
Yeah, well, the launch market is somewhere between a $10 and $20 billion TAM. So that in itself is, when you compare it to the whole space market, the whole space economy is worth about $360 billion.
US?
US, yeah. But that's predicted to go to somewhere between 1 and 2 trillion by 2030, depending on which banker's report you want to read. So there's no argument that the space industry is in a massive growth phase. And Neutron really puts us in an ability to take a big chunk of that market. But it's not really the $10 billion launch TAM that we're going after with Neutron. Rocket Lab is not about a rocket. It's not about a satellite. It's about combining those two things together to go after a much bigger opportunity. And that's kind of the important thing here. Is like the rocket is the enabler. It's not the end point.
I do want to talk to you about being an end-to-end space company and your place in that sort of future, but while we're still talking about finances, do want to ask you about unit economics. Building a new, much bigger rocket is very expensive.
Yep.
Cost control, though, really determines survivability in this game, as it does in many games.
Yep.
How do you think about the unit economics? And you've already mentioned reusability, but how important is reusability in that piece?
I mean, reusability is a big important element. So even on Electron, 70% of the total cost of the rocket is in that first stage that we go and recover. So Neutron is even better than that in some respects, because it's designed from day one to be a reusable rocket, not kind of appended with stuff like we had to do with Electron. So the unit economics in that standpoint is really, really important. And it's also important to understand, like, a small rocket is the hardest rocket to make work, and the hardest rocket to make work, both financially and also from an engineering perspective, because there's just so low margins everywhere. And the reason why it's difficult is, like, a launch range doesn't care, a safety team doesn't care if the rocket is 1 meter diameter or 10 meters in diameter. Same amount of people. So you have to amortize all of those functions across a $7.5 million sticker price. So it's so much harder to make all that close and make margin. Whereas if you go to Neutron, it's a $50 million plus sticker price, it's the same size team. And the reason why I think we're going to be really, really competitive here is because we've had to come up with really clever ways to take a 50-person flight safety team into a 5-person flight safety team. And when you apply that to like Neutron, it's a huge amount of saving.
What's the margin difference on an Electron rocket versus what will be on a Neutron?
Well, we're aiming for 50% gross margin on both products.
But obviously higher price, the margin's bigger, 50%
totally.
on a more expensive rocket.
Yep.
Okay. How low can that cost go? Because if you look at everything that combines that cost, it's fuel, materials, as you mentioned, the team, and maybe a bit of maintenance on the ground and on the rocket as it comes back down. But at what point does a spacecraft become like an aircraft and it comes back down, you turn it around at a cheap cost and get it back up?
Well, I mean, that's utopia, right? That's what everybody wishes for.
It's what you're aiming for, isn't it?
Yeah, it is what everybody aims for. Unfortunately, the reality of physics is a real pain in the butt. As I mentioned before, 2% of the total rocket's mass is the payload. And it's even worse than that when you make a vehicle reusable, because you're carrying all that extra parasitic mass. So, as much as everybody wants like an aircraft-like operations, there needs to be some pretty amazing breakthroughs in propulsion or materials or something major to really make that a reality. I mean, we're all kind of having a crack at it, and it's all suboptimum. But to truly make an aircraft-like operation, there has to be some breakthrough somewhere, because the physics is just fighting you the whole way. Like if the Earth's mass was just a little bit heavier, we wouldn't get anything to space. It would just be physically impossible.
Do you think it is possible to make spacecraft like aircraft eventually?
Eventually, I think it is, but like I say, there's going to have to be some pretty substantial breakthroughs.
Speaking of spacecraft and becoming like aircraft, Elon Musk wants to go to Mars. Jeff Bezos has already gone to space. Why are you not getting into space tourism?
I'm not convinced of the market, and I think you can look at Virgin Galactic, and they're now operational, and it's like not a great business. I think there's plenty of people that would love to take the ticket. But I still think that market is very unproven and not that large. And I don't think this is forever. I'm often asked about human spaceflight, and when is Rocket Lab going to put a capsule on the top of Neutron? And the answer to that question is kind of exactly the same answer to this question. It's like when there is a market, like when there is a destination. At the moment, there's one customer for orbital space travel, and that's NASA. Until there's many more customers, then it's a really difficult kind of business to square in my eyes.
So fair to say, ruling out space tourism for now, Rocket Lab's not going to get into it?
Well, I've had to eat a hat because I ruled stuff out, so I'm not going to rule anything out.
Never say never.
Never say never, but it's certainly not a market we're like pursuing at the moment. I think space tourism to orbit when there is a destination. If someone goes and puts a giant hotel up there and like there's actually a real destination other than what NASA needs, then sure. But I think the market needs to develop a bit.
If we look at what's happening in the market now, you know this, but just to bring it up, we're mostly sending satellites for communications, a bit of defence up to orbit. I'd love your thoughts on other industries that are emerging out of the so-called space economy, as I call it. You've recently worked with Varda to help manufacture pharmaceuticals in space, which is incredibly interesting. What other opportunities like that do you see as space becomes more open for business?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I'll preface that with, I think the biggest thing to happen in space has not yet happened. I think we're kind of at that time when, if you think about the marine industry, there's a few ships going out and exploring, and there's not like a full-on, Musk. There's just a few kind of tentacles in the water, if you will. So I think the biggest thing to happen in space is yet to happen, but clearly, communications, there's some things that the high ground of space gives you, and communications is obviously one, Earth observation is another. But I think there's a tremendous amount of really interesting business plans out there, that's for sure. And you mentioned Varda, pharmaceutical is interesting. I think down mass is interesting. So, everyone's focused on getting stuff up, but I think getting stuff down is equally as interesting market.
Is there anything out there that you think doesn't have legs other than space tourism, that you think that's probably not going to work?
I struggle with some of the asteroid mining and stuff like that. Like in situ space resource utilization makes sense. If I need to land on a rock to fuel up to get to Mars, makes sense. But bringing home platinum from a meteorite back to Earth, I mean, if it was easier to get to orbit, then that would be great. But it's just so incredibly difficult that I kind of struggle with some of those business plans.
You mentioned down mass. What role is Rocket Lab playing in that? Are you active in it?
Yeah, so I mean, Varda is a great example. So, we're responsible for the spacecraft and hosting their capsule, and we're responsible to deorbit that capsule. So that is very difficult trajectory stuff. So we definitely have a hand in that.
Do you see that as a growing part of the business going forward?
Yeah, to be determined. Certainly. One of the reasons why we took that project on is every kind of project that we take on with our customers is always very strategic. It's not always just about generating revenue, and one day we're going to put a capsule on top of Neutron, so we have to be able to get that back. So I'd much rather do all the effort and spend all the time on getting back a little capsule than the first time we ever re-enter something from space that have humans on board.
Are you going to be on board?
Nope.
Me neither, if I say so myself.
No, I have all of the knowledge, but none of the courage. So.
And I do want to talk about one day, and I think this is what investors would love to hear from you. What does Rocket Lab's role in that one-day space economy look like? You call yourself an end-to-end space company now. There's all of these things being thrown out there: down mass, space tourism, pharmaceuticals. How will Rocket Lab look in that bigger space economy in the future?
This is actually really important because I think if you look at the large space companies of the future, it's not going to be a launch company, it's not going to be a satellite company or a down mass company. What it's going to be is a company that is end to end, because everything in space is a giant compromise. Like if you look at a rocket, as an engineer, it drives you literally insane, because an engineer, you want everything perfect, but everything is a compromise against everything else. Then you go and add a spacecraft on the top, and everything in that spacecraft is a compromise against everything else. And then you put them all together and you've got one giant compromise. So if you can end to end all of that and actually just deliver solutions in orbit, you can eliminate so much of the compromise, so much of the bit in the middle, and it starts to get blurry between what is a rocket and what is a spacecraft. And that's when it gets really, really interesting, because at the moment, the industry is very segmented. It's like, I'm a rocket guy, here's my rocket, you make your spacecraft to fit in my rocket. And then the spacecraft guys, here's my spacecraft, you make your rocket, have the environments to suit my spacecraft. And it's very, very segregated. But when you start blurring that together, the power of that is enormous. And I think a good way to not to call out promote any of our competitors, but if you look at what Elon's done with Starlink, is case in point. If you own the spacecraft, you can launch the spacecraft, you can deploy infrastructure at a rate and a frequency and a cost that nobody else can even come close to matching. So Rocket Lab's end goal here is not to be a rocket company, not to be a satellite company, but to ultimately deploy infrastructure in space. Because as we talked about before, the total addressable market in space is 320 billion to $1 trillion. Of that 320 billion, like 300 of it is actually services from space. So whoever can put the services in space and maintain them and deliver service from space at the fastest rate, at the lowest cost, is going to win. And you need your own rocket to do that. And you need your ability to build your own spacecraft to do that. So that's kind of the master plan.
I love it. At the moment, Rocket Lab is 1/3 rocket launching and building and 2/3 space systems.
Correct.
How will that ratio change in the future, do you think?
I think it'll be about that. I mean, like we sat down when we started to get into space systems, and as part of the strategy said, look, we'd really love to get one day to a point 2/3, 1/3. And that might sort of take us 5 years. Well, we did it within the first year and a half. So we really like that kind of ratio. Launch is super lumpy. Spacecraft are built over sometimes years, so it smooths the whole kind of business model out.
You've already raised some challenges, and the challenges of physics. We're casually sitting here about launching things into space, which is kind of not really a casual conversation by any measure. In Elon Musk's own words, this is, quote, f***ing hard. Virgin Orbit has failed. You got some of their assets for cheap, so good on you for getting in on that.
Yep.
What about this industry right now is most challenging? And when you look out to that future that you've just spoken about, what are the challenges that the industry is yet to accept or yet to override, do you think?
That's a great question. So I think there's a number of challenges. So space is incredibly capital intensive. And a lot of people ask us, does SpaceX and you guys have delivered a launch vehicle on cadence with reliability? There's really only those two companies that have done it. What is the difference between those two companies and as you point out, the litany of failures and attempts prior? And the space industry, it's the best way I can describe it is like running through a maze at night, and at every dead end, there's literally, a cliff to fall off. And if you just run flat out and you fall off that cliff, then you're dead. So you've got to run super quickly through the maze, but you can't screw it up. You've got to run quickly, but also stop before you fall off the cliff and realize that you're about to fall off the cliff, turn around and go. So it's just very, very unforgiving in the fact that if you run down the wrong technology path, you're going off a cliff, because the amount of capital you've sunk and time you've sunk, it's almost irreversible to get back out. So it's kind of like make haste very diligently and very, very slowly, if you will. And if I look across, how we develop things and how competitors have developed things, there is a difference. And making those judgment calls at the right time is super important. So that being said, not really answering your question, but that being said, tremendously capital intensive. So very, very, just like when you go to orbit, there's no room for error. In the business, there's no room for error either. You have to be very, very diligent. And, because it is such a capital intensive business, being ruthlessly capital efficient is also super important.
You talk about trying to be diligent while making haste, but the speed of innovation in the so-called space race is immense. What does that require from you as a leader?
That's a difficult question. So, look, I think I'm still the chief engineer of the company, and I really love that role. If you put 10 engineers in a room, you'll have probably 6 different ways about doing it, and sometimes somebody has to be the mediator, and that's kind of, if I have one gift about anything, that's probably it. And so I try and spend as much time, in that part of the business as I do actually, company building and the rest of the business. So yeah, I'm not sure that really answers the question, but
sort of does. Ashley Vance from Bloomberg wrote a book about you recently. You said that at the end of it, he still couldn't figure out who you are and what you're like.
Yeah, I take that as actually a win. That was good. That was the intention. So, yep.
So I'm going to try and figure out who you are here today. I'm just going to ask you to make it a little bit easier on everyone.
Okay.
What do you want investors to know about who you are and what you're doing, what your ambition is here?
Look, naturally I'm very passionate about space, and the reason I'm passionate about space is not necessarily because it's cool. I mean, it is cool, and it's deeply challenging from an engineering perspective. I really enjoyed really difficult problems. The harder the problem, the faster I'll run towards it. But as you entered the building here, you would have read a quote up on the wall, and whatever factory you go into at Rocket Lab, you'll read the same quote, and that is, we go to space to improve life on Earth. And I think the thing that makes me most excited about what we're building here is that there's very few industries that you can put a relatively small thing in situ to create such a massive impact. Like, we launch a few weather satellites and they literally impact millions of people's lives. And building stuff in space is just no different to building infrastructure. Like, you build a bridge and a road in State Highway 1 and it affects the people that use the bridge and the road in State Highway 1. We can put something in orbit and it affect literally every person in the entire planet, in every country, if they use that service. So you can have massive amounts of impact. So what really drives me is, I was taught to, as I was growing up, it's like, do something useful and have the biggest impact you can with your life. And, space is cool and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, I don't know of anything else where you can have as much impact as you can in space. And with impact creates value. What we're trying to build here as a company, there's a lot of space companies that are just, they're all wound up about being cool in space and all the rest of it. What I'm trying to build here is like a multi-generational space company that goes on to deliver impact. And frankly, that's one of the reasons why I took it public. Because if you look at a lot of space companies, my 2 competitors are the 2 richest people on the planet. And you have to ask yourself, when they go, are their companies going to continue? Are they going to continue to grow and thrive? And maybe they will, maybe they won't. But going public almost enforces that. It's do or die. Like, you have to build a profitable company to survive. And if you build a profitable company, it will survive, and it can go on to be multi-generational. To me, the biggest failure would be if I built Rocket Lab and then retired or died and then it stopped. But that would be, failure for everybody. So one of the whole reasons to go public was to enforce that discipline, to enforce that that company building, to make sure that we have something that is enduring.
Can Rocket Lab survive without you?
Yes, totally. Yeah. Yep. Well, I would have failed. I have to say that because I would completely fail if that was the case. Right now it requires plenty of nurturing, but we have a really laser clear trajectory of where we need to go, and we've just got to crash through a few things and pull a few things off, and it'll be just great.
Is the opportunity for impact infinite? We call it a space race, but is there space for all of you, for Rocket Lab, SpaceX, Blue Origin,
Yep.
ULA? Is there space for all of you in the race?
I think so. I think the market is big enough. Like, the opportunity is big enough, and we're all chasing different things. Elon's going to Mars. Great.
You're not?
Not going to Mars. No. Oh, ironically, we have 2 spacecraft going to Mars, but certainly I have no intention to leave a footprint on Mars. And Jeff is about building huge amounts of infrastructure off Earth, so building Earth off Earth. I guess we're a little bit more strategic about that, and we have to build a profitable business first. And we think there's plenty of opportunities along the way to do really, really cool stuff, but also that build that foundation for an enduring business.
Thank you so much for your time, Peter. It's been amazing to chat.
My pleasure.
Easily the coolest place I've ever filmed an interview. Now, I said this on Twitter, and I'll say it here again. Elon Musk, you deserve a right of reply. I'd love to interview you next. Now go put your money to work. Thanks for watching Markets with Madison, the New Zealand Herald show for interested investors. If you want to stay up to date with financial markets, click the subscribe button below, and you can watch our other episodes here. Stay up to date with all the business news and numbers as they land on nzherald.co.nz.